Welcome to Snail Story, where every tale is a slow journey, yet one that always leads us back to where we truly belong. Today, we invite you to follow the heartfelt journey of a woman and her son, once fleeing from a powerful family carrying fear and wounds that had yet to heal. Deep in the forest, they meet a widowed man, and together, they build a small school, a place where the child can finally laugh, speak, and be heard. But the past doesn't let go easily, and when the estranged father-in-law returns, they must stand up for what they believe is right. This is a story about healing, about love without promises, and about a home built on courage. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because every week, Snail Story brings you another deeply moving journey. Callan. Brooks didn't usually take the trail along Monroe Lake this time of year. Snow had started falling lightly that morning, and the main road was far safer for his drive back to the cabin after a long day delivering pre-winter lumber orders. But for some reason, as he approached the bend where the tall pines cast long shadows over the icy gray lake, Callan turned the wheel. Maybe it was the strange howl of the wind. Maybe it was the pale golden light filtering through the trees and scattering across the path, like a memory he couldn't quite place. Or maybe it was instinct. Years of living alone in the mountains had taught him one thing: sometimes instinct is the last warning before everything changes. The dirt road twisted along the lake's edge, empty, misty, and littered with fallen maple leaves. Callan's pickup truck rolled slowly, tires crunching over half-frozen mud. He reached over to turn the radio down and glanced toward the lake, half covered in ice. And then he saw the boy, a small figure, standing between the edge of the road and the tree line, shivering in a thin ash-gray shirt. His bare feet were caked with snowy mud, and his arms were raised weakly, as if about to collapse. Callan slammed the brakes. The truck slid a little, but stopped in time. He jumped out without grabbing his coat, his old boots sinking into the fresh snow. The boy didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared at Callan with wide, panicked eyes, then pointed toward the trees, toward a patch of snow disturbed, where the leaves had been pushed aside. Callan followed the direction of his hand. Beneath the snow and rotting foliage, he found a woman lying motionless, one side of her face pressed to the frozen ground. Her hair was matted, lips bluish, and a streak of dried blood ran down her cheek to her jawline. She wore a torn coat. Her wrists were scraped, and she had no shoes. Her breathing was so faint. He might have thought she was dead if he hadn't leaned in close. He knelt, pulled off his jacket, and slid it under her back, then gently lifted her into his arms. She was unnaturally light, her body cold as stone. The boy followed silently as Callan carried her to the truck. He asked for nothing, said nothing, just held his mother's hand with the quiet desperation of someone the world had already forgotten. On the drive back to the cabin, Callan kept a steady hand on the wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror at the boy who sat in silence, clutching his mother as her shallow breaths fogged the window. He couldn't help but think of Caleb's his own son, lost to leukemia at the age of 3. Every memory of that day had been folded away, locked tight. But there was something in the boy's eyes that rattled every bolt on that vault. By the time they reached the cabin, the snow had thickened. Callan's 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was playing in the kitchen corner and ran out at the sound of the truck, only to freeze when she saw her father carrying an unconscious woman inside. Callan looked at her and spoke softly. "Can you get me the biggest blue blanket, sweetheart?" Lily nodded and ran off, her light brown hair bouncing with every step. Callan laid the woman on the long bench near the fireplace, added a few pillows for support, and knelt to check her pulse. Still weak, but stronger than before. He took a warm cloth and gently wiped the dirt from her face, careful to avoid the bruises. The boy stood by the bench, his eyes never leaving his mother. "What's your name?" Callan asked. The boy hesitated, then whispered in a hoarse voice, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "Rowan, and your mom's name?" "Vivian," he murmured. Callan nodded. "Rowan, you did a good job finding me. I'm going to help your mom." Rowan didn't answer, only tightened his small fists. Callan boiled water, made a little ginger tea for the boy, and started preparing a simple soup with beans and potatoes. Lily, after delivering the blanket, sat beside Rowan and handed him a worn yellow stuffed fox. "You can borrow this if you want. His name is Kip." Rowan didn't take it at first, but a few minutes later, he wrapped his arms around it. Callan watched the scene, his heart heavy not with sadness exactly, but with something shifting deep inside him. It wasn't pity, nor was it duty. It was something strange, like finding an old broken beam of wood and realizing, if placed just right, it could still hold up a home. He didn't know who Vivian was, didn't know why she and her son were alone in the forest, barefoot in the snow, but he knew the fear in the boy's eyes, knew the fragile rhythm of a mother's breath, and for the first time in years, he couldn't look away. Because sometimes a single moment of stopping on the side of the road can change the direction of your entire life, and maybe, just maybe, today was one of those moments. The morning sun filtered through the fogged-up glass windows, casting pale beams onto the wooden floor where Rowan's small, still-soaked shoes sat beside the fireplace. The cabin was quiet, save for the gentle crackling of firewood and the comforting aroma of toast drifting in from the kitchen. It felt unusually warm inside the little wooden house, warm in a way that wasn't just about temperature. Callan had been up since dawn, as always. He had checked on the woman resting in the guest room, Vivian. She was still breathing steadily, her face less pale than the night before, though her eyes had yet to open. Whether it was deep sleep or her body slowly recovering from complete exhaustion, he wasn't sure. Rowan sat silently on the bench by the window, hugging the stuffed fox named Kip. His gaze was fixed on the snow-covered pines outside. Though it was clear he wasn't really looking at anything, Callan placed a plate of toast and a glass of milk on the table before sitting down beside him. "Would you like something to eat?" he asked gently. Rowan gave a small nod. Callan handed him the plate. The boy didn't say thank you, but he didn't seem scared or withdrawn either. He held the toast with care, nibbling at it like it was a task to be completed, not a meal to be enjoyed. Meanwhile, Lily was sprawled across the living room floor, a picture book open wide in front of her, coloring the moon green. She whispered to her own version of Kip, "I wish Rowan could stay here forever, don't you?" After breakfast, Callan let Rowan sit alone with a book while he went outside to check the pipes. The temperature had dropped lower than forecasted, and the auxiliary heating system on the west side of the cabin was acting up again. When he returned to the shed behind the cabin to grab his toolkit, he stopped in the doorway, surprised. Rowan was already there, standing on a small wooden stool, intently examining the old oil heater Callan kept for sudden cold snaps. Behind it, the lid of the toolbox was slightly ajar, with copper wires, screwdrivers, and scattered parts spread across the floor. Callan was about to ask what he was doing, but then he paused and just watched. Rowan wasn't playing. He wasn't poking at the heater like a curious child. He was taking it apart methodically, unscrewing bolts by hand as if afraid to scratch the worn metal. Then, with a level of focus well beyond his years, he reassembled a component, reconnected a broken wire, and checked the switch. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't fumbling. He was fixing it. "You know how to work on this?" Callan asked, finally breaking the silence. Rowan jumped slightly, but then nodded. The heating core was shorted. The boy replied in a small voice. "I thought maybe I could reconnect it." "Who taught you that?" Callan asked. "No one," Rowan said, turning back to the heater. I just looked at it for a while, and I understood. Callan stepped closer and watched as the boy completed a few final steps, then pressed the switch. A low hum buzzed through the air. The heater kicked on, releasing a soft warmth that crept through the cold shed. There was a long pause. Then Callan chuckled a deep, genuine sound that surprised even himself. "You just fixed it," he said, patting the boy's head. "Took me days the last time. I even had to call a guy in." Rowan glanced down at his hands. "I used to fix things like that at the place we stayed," he mumbled. "My mom couldn't afford repairs, so I tried. Once I blew a fuse. Well, this time you warmed up the whole house," Callan said. "Good job." Rowan pressed his lips together, unsure how to respond to the praise. He clearly wasn't used to it, and in that moment, Callan realized this boy wasn't just clever. He was operating at a speed most adults couldn't catch. And even though they'd met less than a day ago, Callan felt a tug of protectiveness, the same pull he used to feel when he'd try, in vain, to shield Caleb from every needle, every treatment that ultimately couldn't save him. Later that afternoon, Vivian opened her eyes for the first time. She didn't scream, didn't panic. She simply stared up at the ceiling for a few seconds, then turned her head slowly. Wincing from the pain, Callan entered the room with a cup of warm water. "Good afternoon," he said calmly. "You're safe now. My name's Callan." "That boy Rowan Hayes. Your son, right?" Vivian nodded faintly. Eyes were dry and unfocused. "You've been unconscious for nearly 20 hours. I brought you both here after I saw him standing alone in the snow." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything," Callan replied. "I just want you to know no one here asks too many questions. Think there's always something to eat, and the blankets are warm enough." Vivian offered a small, fragile smile. It wasn't quite complete, but it was the closest thing to peace she'd had in a long time. Outside the room, Rowan was sitting beside Lily. The two were cutting paper and drawing airplane designs with colored pencils. Callan stood in the doorway, watching them, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time his home had been filled with this much breath, this many soft pencil strokes on paper. Maybe it was before Caleb was diagnosed. Maybe it had never been, but there was something in the way. These three strangers sat together that felt startlingly close to family, and Callan began to understand. Some people come into your life not to answer the question why, but to ask, now what? And slowly, he started to imagine an answer. Vivian was able to sit up by Tuesday morning, less than 48 hours since. Callan had found her curled beneath a thin layer of snow by the side of the road. Her movements were still slow, her right arm temporarily splinted with duct tape, and a small wooden slat, but her eyes were noticeably clearer. Callan helped her settle into the armchair near the window. A blanket wrapped around her legs, a mug of warm peppermint tea in her hands. He didn't ask much, just sat across from her with a cold cup of coffee and an old, half-open notebook on the table. Lily was sprawled on the rug with Kip, coloring in a picture book, while Rowan crouched near the hearth, carefully arranging small pieces of wood into what looked like a model of some sort. For a while, no one spoke. And yet, the cabin was full of sound, the rare kind of quiet noise that feels like peace. The kind none of them had believed they'd hear again. Vivian was the first to break the silence. "I used to live in an apartment next to the airport," she said softly. "It was so loud I had to turn on a hairdryer at night just to fall asleep. But it was still better than the place before." Her voice was hoarse, but steady, not the tone of someone complaining, but of someone slowly untangling the knots in her mind. Callan nodded gently, not interrupting. "I was a book editor," she continued. "Mostly romance novels, nothing too literary, but I liked it." Then one day, I was assigned to meet a potential client A product design engineer. Smart, charismatic, ambitious. Her eyes grew distant. I didn't know if that was the beginning or the end. I fell in love with him, fast and foolish. We got married 4 months later. I got pregnant 2 months after that. Rowan was born in the middle of summer while I lay in a tiny apartment listening to the sound of jackhammers. Across the street, Callan quietly reached over to refill her tea. My husband's family never liked me, she said. I wasn't from their world-no finance background, no Ivy League degree. My mom was a librarian. My dad was a plumber. They thought I was after his money. But Julian, my husband, he was different. He always said as long as we were happy, that was enough. She paused. Her grip on the mug tightened. But when he died, car crash, mid-business trip, I knew all those promises died with him. After the funeral, they said I didn't belong, that I had distracted him, pulled him off track, that Rowan might not even be his. I didn't have the money to fight people like that in court, and I knew if I gave them one more reason, they'd take him from me. Callan remained silent. He'd seen the faded bruises on her shoulders, seen the way she flinched when a door slammed. He didn't need to ask to know the truth ran deeper and darker than what she was sharing. I ran, Vivian said, not because I was guilty, but because I wasn't strong enough to survive a legal war where they already held every card. She turned to the window, her voice quieter. I moved from state to state, picked up whatever jobs I could, cleaning rooms, baking, dishwashing. But I always kept Rowan learning, even if it was just with old books or offline videos. He's different. He understands machines like they speak to him. And me, I just tried to make sure he had somewhere to sleep every night. Her voice broke slightly, as if brushing against the most fragile thread in her memory. The night you found us, I didn't think we'd make it. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Rowan was barely standing, but still he waited, in the snow, hoping anyone would stop, and you did. Callan leaned back, slowly rotating the mug in his hands. He knew he should say something, but words, when poorly chosen, only cut deeper. After a long pause, he finally spoke. My son Caleb died of leukemia when he was 3, he said. After that, I gave up everything. The house, the job, the city. I bought this land, built this cabin with my own hands, and raised my daughter alone. I thought I was doing it to escape the world, but I think I just needed to prove to myself that I could still build something, even if it was just a roof. Vivian didn't respond, but her gaze softened. It was a kind of understanding that needed no explanation. Both of them had lost. Both of them had started over, not with fresh opportunities, but with broken pieces. Rowan stood up and brought something to his mother's sheet of paper. On it was a pencil drawing of an electric heater, complete with labeled parts and circuits. I fixed the one in the shed, he said. It works now. Vivian reached up and touched his cheek, her eyes stinging. Thank you, sweetheart. Then she turned to Callan. You saved us. Callan shook his head. No. He waved me down. I just stopped. And they sat there in a wooden cabin tucked between snowy peaks, with early morning light casting long shadows over bruised faces, and a boy sketching dreams onto scraps of paper. And in that moment, no one asked what tomorrow would bring, because if there is such a thing as beginning again, perhaps it looks exactly like this. That afternoon, the sky darkened suddenly. Thick clouds rolling in so fast it drained the color from the trees lining the lake. Callan noticed the shift while splitting firewood behind the house. A cold gust swept in from the north, stinging the back of his neck. The forecast hadn't mentioned a storm, but in these mountains, the weather rarely listened to forecasts. He hoisted the bundle of wood onto his shoulder and headed back inside. instinctively checking everything: chimney, shutters, oil lamps, extra blankets. Out here, more than 20 miles from town, preparation wasn't a habit, 'twas survival. Inside the cabin, Vivian was teaching Lily how to fold paper cranes. Rowan was busy piecing together a tiny robot using old circuit parts. Callan had given him the day before. "I think we might lose power tonight," Callan told them calmly. "Go about your evening as usual, Lyle. Just get the wood stove and water ready." Vivian nodded without asking questions. She simply gave Lily's uneven fold a gentle squeeze. The snow started falling at 7 p.m. At first. It was just a misty sprinkle, then quickly thickened into heavy chunks slamming against the windows. The wind howled, rattling the door, even though Callan had reinforced it with a wooden wedge. They were halfway through dinner when the power cut out. Lily jumped. Startled, Rowan froze for just a second. Vivian gripped the edge of her chair so tightly. Her knuckles turned white dot in the sudden darkness. Callan lit the oil lamp. A soft amber glow flickered over the room, casting blurred shapes and shadows. He rested a hand lightly on Vivian's shoulder. "It's okay," he said. "I have a generator if we need it." But she didn't respond. Her face had gone pale. Eyes shut tight. Her breath came in broken gasps. Callan didn't touch her again. He just stayed near and spoke gently, his voice low and steady like wind through pine needles. "Vivian, you're not in that place anymore. This is my cabin. No one here is locked in. No one is lost." She opened her eyes. Her lips trembled. "I'm okay," she whispered. But Callan knew that wasn't entirely true. She wasn't in the storm outside. She was inside another one. "Deep in her past, they used to lock me in the pantry," she murmured. "Dark, damp, no windows, just because I spilled a glass of wine. I never knew how long I'd be kept there. Rowan, he would stand outside the door, calling for me." Callan swallowed hard. He wanted to destroy someone. But all he could do now was anchor the present. "No one will ever do that to you again," he said firmly. "Here, the doors are always open." The oil lamp cast a warm light on her face, revealing bruises that had not yet faded, but in her eyes. Something stirred, something pushing back against the darkness of memory. They returned to the table. Lily pulled Kip close beside her. Rowan got up quietly and walked toward the corner of the room like he was searching for something. Callan was about to ask when he saw the boy putting on his shoes. "Rowan." The boy turned around, wide-eyed, alarmed. "I dropped Kip." "It's okay. We can find him in the moor." Callan didn't finish his sentence. The door burst open. The wind roared in and Rowan dashed out into the storm. "Rowan!" Vivian screamed, trying to follow, but collapsed in pain. Clutching her injured shoulder, Callan grabbed his coat and flashlight and bolted after the boy. The snow slapped his face like needles, sharp and blinding. "Rowan!" he shouted, his voice nearly lost to the wind. "Where are you?" He sprinted toward the back of the house. Following fresh footprints barely visible in the snow, his flashlight scanned the trees by the lake. And then he saw him. Rowan was kneeling under the old maple, clutching Kip with trembling hands, his entire body soaked. "Rowan." Callan dropped to his knees beside him. "You okay?" I didn't want Lily to be sad," Rowan stammered. "She's scared of losing Kip. I dropped him, so I." Callan pulled the boy into his arms. He was shivering like a leaf dot in his small hands. The stuffed fox was soaked and muddy, but intact. "You're an amazing kid," Callan whispered. "Not because you ran out here for a toy, but because you understand what matters." When they returned to the cabin, Vivian was already at the door, holding a blanket and a dry towel, her eyes brimming. She said nothing, just took her son into her arms when Callan placed him down. Rowan still held Kip tightly. Lily stepped forward, gently rested her hand on his shoulder. and whispered, "Thank you." The cabin slowly grew warmer as Callan stoked the fire. Wrapped in blankets, cheeks red from the cold, Rowan sat quietly, but his eyes had a strange kind of peace. Vivian sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders. For the first time in years, she no longer feared losing him. Callan sat across from them, watching the scene. And something stirred in his chest, something both familiar and new, like a frayed string in his heart, had finally been tied back together. He didn't know where this would lead, but one thing was clear, even on a cold night, even from a child's pod. Impulsive act. There are moments that stay with us forever, proof that somewhere between the woods and old wounds, a family can still be built from broken things. And sometimes love begins with a muddy stuffed fox returned to the hands that needed it most. Asterisk. The snowstorm passed as quickly as it had arrived. By morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, melting the frost into slow, quiet droplets that trickled down the glass and hit the wooden floor like a ticking clock. Callan had woken early, out of habit, but because of a dream that wouldn't let him sleep. In the dream, Caleb stood by the fireplace, holding a wooden clock he'd once been obsessed with. He looked up at his father and asked, "Can you fix time?" And all Callan could do was kneel and wrap the boy in an embrace that belonged to a world without words. He stepped out of the bedroom into the soft-lit kitchen, brewed coffee, and walked straight to the wooden cupboard beneath the staircase, where an old tin box sat, filled with papers he hadn't dared touch in years. He opened the lid, old photos, blueprint sketches of the house, crayon, scribbles from Caleb, and wedged between them a thick envelope sealed and embossed with the words, "Marchand. Aerotech Confidential." The letter had arrived 3 days after Caleb's funeral. A man in a black suit, driving a sleek car without plates, had knocked on the door. He'd said only one thing: "Mr. Whitmore sends his regards." At the time, Callan couldn't even remember what day it was. He hadn't opened the letter, not out of anger, but because no arrangement of words could bring his son back. But now here in this cabin, with Rowan sitting nearby, gently brushing Kip's fur after their snowy adventure, with Vivian folding Lily's clothes in the living room, and the soft laughter of children blending with the hum of the stove, Callan felt a quiet in his heart, quiet enough to face something he had once buried. He picked up the envelope, ready to carry it to the kitchen table, when he froze. Behind him, Vivian stood still, her eyes locked on the paper in his hands. "Can I see the name on that?" she asked. Her voice was calm. It cut like a blade through memory. Callan handed her the letter. She turned it over. "Read the bold printed name, Harrison Whitmore." She took a step back, her free hand clenched into a fist. "I know that name," she said. "Too well." Callan's voice was lower than usual. "He's connected to you." Vivian took a deep breath. "He was my father-in-law, founder of Marchand Aerotech. A man who once said I was the single stain on his son's life." The kitchen went silent. Callan set the letter on the table, as though it had suddenly gained twice its weight. "I didn't know he sent this," he said. "I didn't open it. At the time, I couldn't trust anything or anyone beyond these walls." Vivian didn't blame him. She sat down, smoothing the wrinkles on her old sleep shirt, her eyes fixed on the small flickering fire in the stove. "After Julian, my husband, died, Harrison didn't come to the funeral. But his people did. They brought terms. If I signed away Rowan's inheritance, they'd give me a house, a bank account, a non-disclosure agreement. I tore it up in front of them. And after that?" Callan asked. Vivian let out a soundless laugh. "I was set up. A fake robbery. A vague charge of asset misuse. Rumors that I'd forged passports. I knew who was behind it, but I had no way to prove it. It came down to 2 choices: run or lose my son." Callan nodded slowly. He understood. Far too well. He remembered the same helplessness choking him in Caleb's final years. when doctors refused a last hope trial because there was no statistical chance. When the hospital erased Caleb's name from the patient board only. To move it to the hospice list, I think, Callan said quietly. We're standing at an old crossroads. But maybe this time we're not alone. Vivian turned to him. For the first time, her gaze wasn't just Penit, was a question. And a fragile flicker of trust. So fragile that if Callan blinked, he might miss it. I want to know what that letter says, she said, but I want you to read it first. I've had too many things in my life decided by other people. Callan nodded. He didn't open the letter right away, not out of fear, but because he needed to be clear-headed. Not as a grieving father, but as a man ready to face whatever it said. That afternoon, while the two children were busy building a pretend telescope out of paper tubes and old mirror shards, and while Vivian lay resting on the couch, Callan sat at the kitchen table and opened the letter. The ink was blue. The handwriting, elegant and slanted, belonged to someone who had once studied calligraphy. Mr. Brooks, I do not expect your forgiveness. Nor do I assume this letter will be welcome in the darkest hour of your life. But I have followed your story from afar as one man who failed to be a father to another. He could not save my son. I have not protected my grandson. I don't know if you would ever consider doing something for me, not for my sake, but for the boys. But if you're reading this, it means there is still hope. Callan stopped. His hand clenched the edge of the paper. Outside, the sun was beginning to fade, but inside him, a sliver of light had just broken through. Not from Harrison, but from the child running toward him now, holding up a sketch of a wind turbine made from chopsticks and a broken razor blade. I think, if I add a battery, it'll spin for real, Rowan said, beaming. Callan smiled. You're right. He didn't call the boy kid anymore, and in his mind, the name Harrison Whitmore was no longer a threat. It was a turn in the road, a distant hill dot, an old gust of wind. That morning, Lily was sitting on the front porch, coloring a star map Rowan had drawn the day before. She used a purple crayon to mark a place she called Cookie Planet and a yellow dot for a spot labeled the sun that never yells. Rowan sat beside her, carefully unscrewing the control panel from an old electric fan practice project. As Callan had called it when he handed it over, the cabin was wrapped in the quiet sounds of the forest, broken only by the gentle laughter of the two children. Inside, Callan was in the kitchen, preparing a batch of cinnamon toast, his arms dusted with flour up to the elbows, when Lily suddenly shouted, Dad, there's a weird car out there. Looks like one of those movie cars. He wiped his hands on a towel and stepped to the door, and she was right. It was definitely not a car built for mountain roads. It was a vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith. Deep navy, polished to such a shine it reflected the treetops above. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the dirt road leading to the cabin. The back door opened slowly. A man stepped out. He was no longer young, but his stance was solid, and the ebony cane in his hand did little to diminish the presence he carried, the kind of presence sharpened through decades of boardroom deals, closed-door negotiations, and first-class airport lounges reserved for the powerful. His hair was silver white, slicked back neatly. His dark suit was tailored to perfection, and his shoes gleamed as if they'd been polished. Just moments before leaving the city, Callan didn't need to ask his name. One look at the man's posture, hey, he already knew. Harrison Whitmore. Vivian had just stepped outside when she froze. Her eyes widened. Her hand clutched the edge of her robe. Rowan stopped turning his screwdriver and looked at the man, not afraid, but watchful. As if somewhere deep in his intuition, he recognized that this person was a missing piece no one had ever told him about. Harrison took a few steps forward, stopping about 10 feet from the porch. He removed his hat. His voice was rough, but steady. I came alone. No lawyers, no conditions, no pressure. Just an old man hoping to meet the only piece of his bloodline he once chose to ignore. Callan didn't respond right away. He stepped down from the porch, placing himself between Harrison and the three standing silently behind him. Vivian said nothing, but her breathing quickened. Rowan walked toward his mother and took her hand not too tightly, just enough to say, "I'm okay as long as you are." Harrison bowed his head slightly. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I carry no promises to make anything right. I only came to see the boy and to say what I never got to tell his father." Callan looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod permission. But not an open door. Harrison turned to Rowan. "You're Rowan, aren't you?" The boy nodded, his eyes never leaving the man. "You like machines?" "Yes," Rowan said. "Where did you learn?" "By taking things apart, seeing what's inside, then putting them back together." Harrison gave a faint smile. Something softened in the way he looked at the boy. "Your father was the same. He once took apart my antique clock when he was 8. Didn't break a thing. Even added a music feature." Vivian swallowed hard. Callan turned to Rowan. "You want to show him the fan you fixed yesterday?" Rowan hesitated, then nodded. He went inside and returned with the old desk Vanit's motor, repaired with copper wire and electrical tape. "I haven't put the casing back on yet, but it works now." He flipped the switch. A steady whir filled the air, the blades spinning smoothly as if it had never been broken. Harrison watched closely, then said, "You're like your father, but more." He turned to Callan. "I know I have no rights, but if this boy was ever tied to a legacy, I believe he deserves to know where he came from. And one day, to choose whether or not that legacy matters to him, not anyone else." Callan glanced at Rowan. The boy didn't speak, but the tension in his eyes had faded, not gone, but softened into something closer to curiosity. Vivian sat down, as if to stay grounded, making sure her son remained within arm's reach. Then she spoke. Slowly, "You tried everything to erase us. Why show up now?" Harrison met her gaze. No flinching. "Because I've lost too much. And I've come to realize what I lost wasn't just a grandson. 'Twas the chance to correct a mistake before there's no time left to do so." Callan crossed his arms. His eyes didn't waver. "What do you want from the boy?" Harrison shook his head. "I don't want to take him. I didn't come here to fight or to prove anything. I only want him to have a choice. He may carry the Whitmore name if he wants to. He may inherit or not. But if one day he wants to dream bigger than this cabin, I'll be the one to open that door. No pressure, no strings, just unlocked." Rowan looked up at his mother. Vivian didn't answer. She simply placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Then Rowan turned to Harrison. Voice small but clear. "I don't know who you are, but I know who Mr. Callan is. And right now, I want to stay here." Harrison bowed his head. "You have every right to make that choice." He placed a small wooden box on the porch. "Inside is a ring your father used to wear. Nothing fancy, no gold, no diamonds. But I believe it belongs with someone who deserves it." Then he turned to leave no demands, no final words, before stepping into the car. He looked at Callan. "I was never good at being a father, but maybe I can learn to be a grandfather." The Rolls-Royce rolled away from the forest's edge, leaving 3 people behind in the fading afternoon light. Callan looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Rowan, and the boy, in that moment, reached out to hold both their hands, not because he felt lost, but because he now understood he had been chosen, and he was beginning to learn how to choose in return. The week following Harrison's visit, the cabin settled back into its usual rhythm, but the air felt different. Rowan was quieter than usual. not confused, but contemplative, processing something far too big for a 10-year-old to carry alone. He still woke early to split wood with Callan, still helped Lily practice spelling by oil lamp light, but now and then he would sit by the small wooden box Harrison had left, resting his hand on the lid as though speaking silently to a father he'd never seen. Vivian noticed all of it, and each night, after the children had gone to sleep, she would sit on the porch, eyes following the faint glimmers scattered across the sky where city lights didn't reach, but unspoken truths still lingered. Callan would often sit beside her. Mamie never asked, never pushed, but in his silence, she felt more heard than in any conversation she'd had before. That night, Vivian couldn't sleep. She wrote insteadnet in a diary, but in letters, one to herself, one to Rowan, and one to the name she had spent years running from Edward Marsh, and she knew the time had come to step out of the shadows. Not just for herself, but because her son needed a mother who no longer flinched at the sound of that name. The next morning, she packed a small bag. Lily asked, "Where are you going?" Vivian knelt down, brushing the girl's hair gently behind her ear. "I'm going to reclaim a part of myself, so the rest can stay whole." Callan stepped out the door and saw her standing there. He looked at the bag, then at her eyes. He understood. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, softly. "I know," she replied, "but this time I want to be the one who steps forward." She left in the old truck Callan had repaired the month before her destination, a small town where Edward now ran the region's largest winery. He still lived in the same grand estate, still had staff, still carried the kind of reputation that made people lower their voices when saying his name. But when Vivian passed through the wrought iron gates, she wasn't the battered young wife of years past. She was a mother, and this time she came carrying her voice. "Do you remember me?" she asked the elderly butler at the door. He froze in place, eyes widening. "Dear God, Vivian." She didn't wait for him to announce her. She walked straight through the grand foyer. Edward was in the study, holding a glass of red wine. When he saw her, he stood up sharply, his face twisted with disbelief. "You have the nerve to show your face here?" he spat. "After everything, I didn't come to apologize," Vivian interrupted. Her voice was steady. "I came to tell you. Rowan is alive, and he is no longer a shadow of the Martian family." Edward threw his glass at the floor, shattered, red wine bleeding into the carpet. "You kept him from us for 10 years, he roared. "You robbed him of his name, his place, his legacy. That's theft." Vivian didn't flinch. "I didn't steal anything. I rescued my son from a family where women were treated like possessions, and men were taught to destroy instead of build. Rowan doesn't need the Martian's name to know who he is. He needs kindness, and I found it." Edward advanced, his voice like a growl. "You think I'll just let this go?" "I don't need your permission," Vivian replied coldly. "I need you to understand Rowan is not your heir. He's a child, and he will grow up free, not afraid, not manipulated. He is my grandson," Edward shouted, "and I'm his mother." Vivian answered, eyes locked on his. "The one who protected him from your fists. From your so-called legacy that's nothing but a dirty name wrapped in illusion. From now on, if anyone in your family comes near him, I'll fight back with the law if I have to. I have witnesses, doctors, a full report ready to file. Don't test me." Edward's eyes were dark with fury, but he didn't raise a hand, didn't shout again, because he knew the woman before him was no longer a victim. She had survived, and now she held the upper hand. Vivian turned to leave. She said nothing more. But before she stepped out the massive wooden door, she paused and said quietly, "If you ever truly wish to meet your grandson, learn how to ask and bring respect with you. By the time she returned to the cabin, it was nightfall. Rowan and Lily were reading by the fire. Callan was sitting on the porch, a small flashlight beside him, like a quiet lighthouse waiting in the dark. She stepped toward him, placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and whispered, "I did it." He looked at her. Didn't ask anything else, but in his eyes was something unspoken, a recognition, as though he'd just witnessed a rebirth. Not through miracles, but through courage. That night, as she held her son close while he slept, Vivian whispered, "I couldn't stop you from hurting before, but I swear no one will ever take your future from you. Not again." Outside the window, snow fell softly, but inside the cabin, the fire glowed warm and hearts stood stronger than ever before. That morning, Callan woke earlier than usual. The sky had not yet lightened. A thin mist clung to the cabin roof, and the embers in the fireplace still gave off a quiet warmth. He brewed coffee, then stood by the door, holding a handwritten note. Vivian had left the night before. "I believe the children deserve a place to be heard, not a big school. It's not standardized lessons, but a space where children who've been hurt can find their voice again, reconnect, and know they're not invisible. If you're still thinking about turning that old lakeside land into something meaningful, I'd like to try." Callan read it over and over again. He remembered a Vivian who once trembled in fear of the dark, who used to lower her gaze whenever a man raised his voice. And now she was gone. In her place stood a mother brave enough to face her past, and now dream of a future, not just for her own son, but for others. And he knew he couldn't turn his back on that dream. That spring, the clearing near the forest edge, once an abandoned lumber shed, began to change. Callan handled the main repairs, reinforcing the roof, framing new windows, and installing a solar-powered heating system. He had learned to build from an online forum. Rowan and Lily helped sweep the floors, plant flowers along the yard, and paint wooden name signs in blotchy, cheerful colors. Vivian reached out to old friends, former social workers, asking for books, supplies, and more importantly, a list of children who had been rejected from public schools for being too difficult. She told them simply, "No child is too difficult to be loved." 1 month later, the first class opened its doors. 3 children came. One boy had lost part of his hearing in a home explosion. One girl had survived domestic violence, and a boy who hadn't spoken a word in 2 years since his mother left. They sat curled in the corners of the classroom, avoiding eye contact, gripping their backpacks like armor. But Vivian didn't teach them the alphabet or addition. She told stories. She pulled out a sheet of paper and drew the road leading to the cabin. "If this was a secret place," she asked gently, "what would you name it?" She had them write letters to themselves, not to send, just to say, "This is how you talk to the person in the mirror." Sometimes Rowan and Lily joined, not as students, but as companions. Lily would bring homemade cookies. Rowan, patient and quiet, would offer old robots for the kids to take apart and rebuild. The children slowly grew braver. One day, the silent boy suddenly shouted, "Careful." When Lily fell and scraped her knee, the room fell completely still, then erupted in soft gasps of joy. Like everyone was afraid to wake the miracle that had just happened. Vivian pulled the boy into her arms, tears soaking her collar. She didn't say a word because she knew some doors only open if you're willing to wait by them long enough. By the end of summer, 8 children had joined. The little school was named the Listening Pine, as suggested by Rowan. On the trunk of the old pine tree near the gate, Vivian hung a wind chime. She told the children, "If one day you feel like you can't say what you're feeling, come ring the chime. Someone will hear you." One afternoon after class, Vivian and Callan sat on the porch, watching the kids play hide-and-seek in the woods. Lily screamed with laughter as Rowan found her hiding spot. The boy who had once refused to speak now stood counting loudly, his numbers all mixed up. But his joy undeniable. Callan turned to Vivian and asked quietly, "What do you think about turning this into something long-term? We could reach out to the community, fundraise, maybe build a reading room." Vivian smiled, the golden light catching. In her eyes, "I used to think I didn't deserve anything lasting," she said softly. "But maybe it's time I let myself believe otherwise." Callan didn't respond. He simply reached out, and for the first time rested his hand gently on hers. She didn't pull away in that quiet touch. There was no promise, only this: they were walking the same path now. That night, as Vivian tidied up the classroom, she found a small, folded piece of paper tucked into one of the desks. The handwriting was uneven, clearly a child's. "I don't know who will read this, but if someone is here, I just want to say, I'm not scared anymore." She folded the note, placed it back in the desk drawer, and stepped outside where the wind whispered through the pine trees and the chime rang gently. The Listening Pine was not a big school, but it was the beginning of many things no one had dared to dream before. November began with dry, biting winds and the scent of fallen pine needles covering the front yard. The Listening Pine still opened each morning, welcoming children with the soft chime of wind bells and the smell of freshly baked cookies. Rohan had changed almost completely. He no longer hid quietly behind a book. Now he raced, wiped down chalkboards, and laughed loudest when Lily told one of her silly, clumsy jokes. Vivian watched him every day, mother, teacher, and a woman who had learned to stand tall on her own 2 feet. But peace rarely lingers too long. One afternoon, just as the day's lessons had ended, Callan was packing away garden tools when a sleek black car pulled up to the gate. He recognized the license plate instantly and set down his shovel. The door opened. Out stepped Edward Martian Trim, composed in a deep gray overcoat. The silver-handled cane in his grip wasn't for support, but a statement, a symbol of the power he carried wherever he went. Callan stepped out to meet him, eyes wary. "Who are you here for?" Edward removed his gloves, his tone calm but cold. "I've come to see my grandson." "You don't have an appointment," Callan said, "and I'm not sure Rowan wants to see you." Edward glanced around, distaste clear on his face. "I know what this place is. A patch of cheap land with a handful of children no other school would take. She thinks hiding in the woods will erase the past." Callan clenched his fists. But before he could respond, Vivian appeared from the schoolhouse, a chalk-streaked scarf still draped around her shoulders. "No," she said, voice calm, each word sharp. "I'm not hiding. I just chose to live where shouting no longer echoes." Edward's eyes darkened. "I've come to take Rowan home. He needs proper education, preparation for the role he's meant to inherit." "You really think some creaky cabin and a few storybooks can change his destiny?" Vivian stepped forward. "My son's destiny isn't yours to dictate. He doesn't need to be the heir to a family name stained by your control and arrogance." Edward scoffed. "You're still that delusional girl, aren't you, Vivian? You ran off, stole my grandson, and built this pathetic little world to pretend you've won something." "I don't need to win," she replied. "I just want my son to live without flinching every time he hears heavy footsteps behind him." Edward moved closer, voice low and venomous. "I'll sue. I have lawyers. I have documents. You won't stop me forever." "You can try," Callan said, stepping between them. "But this time, she's not standing alone, and you're not someone people fear anymore." Edward stared at them, silent for a moment, then turned back to his car. Before getting in, he muttered, "If you want a war, prepare yourselves. I don't. Forget what's mine." The car pulled away, leaving behind a trail of dust sharp as a threat. Vivian stood still, eyes fixed on the gate until the car disappeared into the pines. Callan touched her hand gently. "You okay?" She nodded. "I am. I just didn't expect him to come back this soon." That night, after putting Rowan and Lily to bed, they sat at the kitchen table. Vivian placed a folder in front of Callan. "These are all the Records doctor's reports. Photos, everything I've collected to protect Rowan if Edward follows through. But I'm still scared." Callan didn't offer cliches or empty comfort. He just took her hand and held it firmly. "I'm scared too. I'm not letting you face that fear alone." She looked at him, and for the first time let her tears fall without shame, because the man in front of her didn't see her as broken but as someone learning to walk again. A few days later, he received a parcel, a court summons. From the family court, Edward was officially pursuing custody of his grandson. But instead of panic, Vivian exhaled and turned to Callan. "So it's time the world hears the truth." Vivian told Rowan everything on a rainy afternoon while he was repairing Lily's toy truck. He was silent for a long while. Then he asked, "If I have to go to court, do I have to wear a suit?" Vivian laughed, pulling him into a hug. "You just have to be yourself." The legal battle wasn't easy. Edward had high-priced attorneys, fake witnesses, and every tactic to wear them down. But Vivian wasn't alone. Former students of the Listening Pine wrote letters in support. Doctors who once treated her injuries came forward as witnesses, and Callan, the man who once just fixed roofs, became her strongest pillar. Eventually, the judge requested to meet Rowan in person. That day, he wore a brown sweater and neatly combed hair. Walking into the hearing room, holding a drawing in his hand, when asked where he wanted to live, he laid the picture on the table. A wooden cabin, a pine forest, a tree covered in name signs of his friends. "I want to stay here," Rowan said, "because here I know who I am." Nothing else was needed. Some say justice isn't always in legal arguments, but in the truth. When spoken by a child who knows love, Vivian stepped out of the courthouse that day into the cold sunlight. She lifted her head, and for the first time in 10 years, she felt like she had finally left Edward Martian's shadow behind her. 1 year after the court ruling, spring returned to the old pine forest. The last chills of winter melted away, revealing soft earth and the scent of damp wood left behind by a long, frozen season. The Listening Pine, the little school nestled in the woods, now had 2 new classrooms, a greenhouse for growing vegetables, and a small library named after Vivian's grandmother, Lucinda's Corner. There were no flashy signs, no advertisements, but every day, children came knocking. And parents arrived from distant towns asking, "Do you still have room for my child?" And each time, Vivian would smile and say, "If your child needs to be heard, there's always a place here." Rowan had become the school's youngest assistant teacher. He was diligent, patient, and had a gift for remembering every student's name even now that the class had grown to more than 30 kids. He told stories so well that even the children, who once struggled to speak, began to whisper lines along with him. And Lily, with her pigtails and paint-splattered apron, was now the school's official artist. Every wall bore tiny handprints and splashes of color as her way of saying, "I was here." Callan remained quietly present, fixing the roof, wiring lights, trimming grass at dawn. But the biggest change wasn't in the buildings or the number of students, it was in Vivian's eyes. She no longer lowered her gaze when strangers approached, no longer apologized before anyone could complain. She moved through the world like someone who knew she belonged, and knew she held in her hands something more precious than any title, a family. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Vivian sat in her small office by the window, sorting through grant applications for local funding. Callan knocked gently and walked in with 2 cups of ginger tea. She smiled. "I thought you'd gone to bed." He sat across from her and took a sip. "Today makes exactly 1 year since the court ruling," he said. "I figured maybe we should mark the occasion somehow." Vivian nodded. "I thought about that too, but not for me." "For who, then?" he asked. "For all of them. For the kids who thought they weren't worthy of love. For the mothers who had to flee in the night. For the men who've lost and didn't know where to begin again. And for you." Callan was quiet for a moment. Then, from his pocket, he pulled out a small box. No diamond, just a silver ring, with a message etched on the inside. "You can rebuild anything, even a heart." Vivian opened it. Our hands trembled. Callan didn't. "Neil," he simply looked at her, steady and calm. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But if you want, I'd be honored to build one more home with you." Vivian laughed through tears. "I used to think I'd spend the rest of my life never being truly seen. But you saw me, and you stayed." She didn't need to say more. When she slid the ring onto her finger, every answer was already there. 3 weeks later, they held a small wedding rite there in the woods, beside the pine tree, with the wind chimes, no lavish dress, no grand guest list, just children carrying wildflowers, Rowan officiating the ceremony, and Lily's giant painting hanging behind them, scrawled in crooked letters. "Today is the happiest day of our lives." After the vows, they shared fresh bread, drank cocoa, told stories, and played ring toss under the trees. No one mentioned Edward Marsh, and no one spoke of violence or the darkness that came before. Because that day, the past no longer held power. It was simply one chapter in a long journey that led them here. That night, Vivian sat on the porch where Rowan and Lily were reading beneath warm golden lights. She joined them, brushing Lily's hair gently. "Did you have a good day?" she asked. Both children nodded. Rowan said, "You know, Mom, I used to think I didn't need anyone, but now I like knowing there's somewhere I belong." Lily leaned against her. "Me too. This place is warmer than any house I've ever lived in." Vivian didn't respond. She just wrapped her arms around them both, and in her heart, a new dream quietly began to bloom. Not just of a school, not just of a home, but of a forest sanctuary for anyone who had once wandered, once frozen, once believed they could never love again. And she knew, with Callan by her side, with these children in her arms, with spring always finding its way back, that dream was no longer a luxury. It was the life they were already living. Perhaps the most beautiful part of today's story wasn't the little school in the forest, nor the wedding beneath the pine trees, but the moment when people who had once been broken chose to lay the past down and start again together. Because sometimes family isn't where you're born, it's where someone is willing to stand by you, no matter how dark your past may be. Thank you for staying with Snail Story until the very end. If this story touched something in your heart, feel free to leave a comment. And don't forget to like, subscribe, so we can meet again each week through slow, soulful journeys full of hope.